Well, welcome to episode 208 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Joy Division's second full LP, Closer, which came out in the summer of 1980 on Factory Records. I have a 2015 reissue, which was done by Factory Records and is just superb, just like the one for Unknown Pleasures. In terms of what to expect, well, this is pretty much a huge leap for the band. I won't say a huge leap forwards because I really love the sound of Unknown Pleasures, but here, very clearly, the band and their producer Martin Hannett have totally decided not to create Unknown Pleasures Part 2. When I reviewed Unknown Pleasures, I touched on some of their history, including the fact that Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner both attended the famous 1976 gig in Manchester by the Sex Pistols and decided to form a band from that point. They found a singer, Ian Curtis, through an ad, and they hired him without an audition actually, just based on his personality and the fact they liked him. That trio, setting their sights on punk stardom, began life in early 1977 as Warsaw. They tried out 3 different drummers that summer. The first, Tony Tabak, and the second, Steve Brotherdale, only lasted about a month each. Brotherdale in particular was not that popular with the rest of the band. Coming back from a demo session, they pull over the car, say they've got a flat tire, ask him to get out and check. When he does, they drive off. They advertise for another drummer and they end up with Stephen Morris, again, hired largely on the basis of personality fit more than his drumming skills at the time. Now a completed lineup, they're still very much a punk band, and to avoid confusion with another UK punk band called Warsaw Pact, in the early 1978 they changed their names to Joy Division. Joy Division, of course, was the name of a sexual slavery wing in one of the Nazis' concentration camps, which makes it, to say the least, a highly controversial choice of name. And the controversy around the band only increases later that spring when their debut EP comes out, and A Deal for Living, which of course includes a Hitler Youth drummer on the cover. Much of the middle part of 1978 was spent by the band trying to find a label who shared their vision. They were signed to RCA for quite a while, but eventually ended up doing a couple tracks with Martin Hannett for Factory Records, which was just starting up. And those 2 tracks end up coming out in a Factory Sampler LP, and they're both highly praised by the music press. The band buys out their RCA Records contract, and they move to Factory Records. The praise at this point starts to come from the highest locations in the critical establishment in the UK. The New Musical Express has Ian Curtis on the cover in January 1979, and John Peel, the most famous DJ on Radio 1, has him on his show the same month. So everything's going great, except the wheels are also kind of coming off because Ian Curtis, the very unusually gifted lead singer who sings in this kind of deadpan and who was completely in the process of breaking the mold of what a rock star or any kind of musical star would be like, is suffering from epilepsy. He's also really struggling with his mental health, although that's not really going to manifest itself more severely until the coming winter. That April, working with Hannett, they made Unknown Pleasures, with all the sonic innovation that arguably made them famous, although at the time they weren't that happy with Hannett's work. In the fall of that year, they go on a UK tour with Buzzcocks, and this is a development which makes them think, okay, we've got a record out, we've got some tour dates coming up, we can actually afford to quit our day jobs. So they quit their day jobs, but they're still not making a ton of cash. I think they were making £3 a day or something like this on the road. And on that tour, Buzzcocks detailed one of their roadies to be the guy whose specific job it was to prevent the band members of Joy Division from eating the backstage meal that was provided to the headliners. All this time while they're touring, Joy Division, of course, are still writing songs, and their sound is developing leaps and bounds. And that winter in the studio, they recorded a number of singles which show just how fast this progression was happening, including, of course, She's Lost Control, and maybe most significantly, Love Will Tear Us Apart. They toured Europe in January 1980. At this point, Curtis's epilepsy is really starting to become an issue, and so is his mental health. He's also got a couple of other situations on the go. One, his wife is pregnant with her first child, his wife of about 5 years or so. But at the same time, he's also having an affair with this Belgian promoter, a woman called Annick Honoré. As a band, in the early part of 1980, Joy Division were really on the march, but their problems at the same time were worsening. This record is made in March 1980, and Martin Hannett is once again in the production booth. It was recorded at Britannia Row Studio in London, which had been built by Pink Floyd and kitted out by Pink Floyd, with all the bells and whistles that you might imagine a mid-70s behemoth rock band like Pink Floyd would put in. And so the sonic options available to Hannett and the textures and sounds that he was able to create with Joy Division were night and day compared to what had been available on Unknown Pleasures. This record is arguably a transitional record, although a transition to what is unclear because with Curtis's death there are so many unanswered questions. But the songs on here very much come from 2 different periods. A bunch of guitar-driven songs written largely in the latter stages of 1979 when they were on tour with Buzzcocks, and then when they were back home in the early part of 1980, a whole bunch of synth-driven songs, which of course is a future direction that many of the band members would take. Hannett, who, although this is debated in terms of the actual extent, has a fair amount to do with their early success, was an obsessive genius and really quite difficult to work with at times. He was extremely judgmental of people he didn't think were up to it. Hook says that he largely considered the band to be a genius and three idiots. On this record, he worked with Sumner, Morris, and Hook in the daytime. He'd then find a way to kick them out, and he'd bring in Ian Curtis and record his tracks at night. It's tempting to conclude that Hannett was just using this bifurcation just to deal with the dummies in the daytime and then bring in the genius at night. But this, of course, would be an injustice to the whole band because they were, all of them, highly innovative. There was also a chasm during these sessions, as there had been on Unknown Pleasures, between the sound that Hannett wanted to get, which is a very spacious, open sound, and the band's preference for something which sounded a lot more like The Clash. Hook and Sumner in particular, although they came to love the record, did not like it at all at first, and Hook remembers going in to talk to Hannett and confront him about the guitar sound on Atrocity Exhibition and not really getting the full hearing that he wished. Meanwhile, Curtis's lyrics are getting more personal and more desperate seeming. He's battling failing physical health, failing mental health. He's a new father. He's got a marriage on the rocks. As the sessions went on, he wasn't sleeping. He was having more seizures and basically spiraling downhill all the way through that month. In the beginning of April, he attempts suicide for the first time. No one, arguably, again with hindsight, takes it as seriously as they should have done. His performances through the rest of that month are really quite damaged by epilepsy. They have to cancel some shows. They're set to tour North America in May 1980. The night before they're going to go on this tour, Ian and his wife Deborah get together to talk about the divorce at their house. He says, look, just leave me alone in the house and I'm going to go off on tour tomorrow and you won't see me again for a while. That evening he watches Werner Herzog's Strohsek, which is kind of like Borat meets Midnight Cowboy. At some point he also listens to some Iggy Pop, and he then goes into the kitchen and hangs himself, and you can only imagine for his wife to find him, and she duly does find him the next day. The band, of course, were in total shock, but the release of this record proceeds anyway in July of that year. The cover, which was of a photo which had been previously selected by the band before Curtis's suicide, is of a tomb, of the Appiani family tomb in Genoa. The designer said, look, are we really going to release the album with this cover given what's happened? And after some deliberation, they said, yeah, so there it is. With Curtis's death, the band never toured to support the record. They'd had an agreement previously that if anybody left the band for any reason, they would change the band's name. So they ditched Joy Division and called themselves New Order. Joy Division were now a thing of the past, leaving Closer, this unpromoted album, kind of like a prehistoric insect trapped in amber, frozen moment in time. Side one starts with Atrocity Exhibition, a fantastic track, interesting too, because Sumner and Hook traded instruments here. You can tell it's already a more immediate sounding record. Hannett is laying off the reverb, thankfully, I think. Isolation is probably the track that's the most prophetic of where New Order was going to go, with this upbeat feel, with these bright sounding synths. Passover is a very Joy Division track. It's very much a bass and drums heavy song with the guitar really just kind of a textural piece. It's probably about religious themes and bolstered by the title, but more than that I can't really make out. Colony has this edgy, almost funky feel to the riff, which Hook and Morris pursue relentlessly, all the while Sumner is adding the soundscaping around the edges. A Means to an End is about a relationship, although it's a relationship with Ian Curtis in it, so it's never really going to be a happy one. On side 2, Heart and Soul has Sumner playing a bass synth, and Hook is playing with the aforementioned 6-string bass, and he's playing the melody. This is the track where Curtis's lyrics probably hint most overtly as impending suicide. The next track, 24 Hours, I find really interesting. It's probably the most rock and roll track on the whole record. It alternates between this moody minor key vamp and then these really upbeat guitar sections. The second last track is The Eternal, which has been called Joy Division's bleakest song. The lyrics are all about this kid with Down syndrome who lived next to Curtis in Macclesfield, who led a very unhappy and unfulfilled life. The final song, Decades, apparently started off with a bossa nova beat, which Martin Hannett hated. Musically, it's really pretty interesting. It's in a minor key, surprise, but the chord changes are really kind of unusual, and the synths here are just lovely. It is the most beautifully atmospheric track on what is quite an atmospheric record. This record shows enormous progress, not just on the part of the band, but also their producer. It adds a whole bunch of new textures and also not a small number of new emotions to the Joy Division sound. It almost defines post-punk, as it maintains this steadfastly cynical and non-conforming attitude that the punks had, but musically at the same time you can tell that they are enormously ambitious. It's Joy Division, so it's not a pick-me-up, but this record has moments of real beauty. It's unforgettable, really, and for me it's 5 out of 5 stars.